All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'll wait just a few more seconds for some more people to come in. Um, Thank you for joining us from wherever you may be. My name is Aaron Smithson, and I am the Housing Design Fellow at the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies. And I'm also a co-editor of the upcoming Joint Center book, The State of Housing Design 2027. Before I get started, I just wanted to mention that the Joint Center's signature annual report, The State of the Nation's Housing, will be released in mid-June. So please keep your eyes peeled on the Joint Center's website and various socials for that announcement. We're very excited to present this roundtable discussion titled Post-Occupancy Evaluations for Affordable Housing Design, in which our five esteemed panelists will join me in a conversation about integrating post-occupancy research more fully into affordable housing design and development processes. Today's event will be available in video format on the Joint Center's YouTube account, accessible via a link on the event page in the coming days. And it will also be transcribed and edited for inclusion in the State of Housing Design 2027 book to be published by the Joint Center early next year. To give a quick sense of that larger book project, the State of Housing Design 2027 will be the second publication in a series examining recently built U.S. housing projects of notable or innovative design, addressing challenges including affordability, social cohesion, sustainability, aesthetics, density, and urbanism. These are photos of the first edition of the book, published back in 2023. The next edition will expand our approach, including a broader array of contributors, new themes, more data analysis, and a series of 3 public programs transcribed for inclusion, of which this event is the second. The first, back in late February, focused on design competitions and procurement, and the third, tentatively scheduled for late June, will focus on livability in office to housing conversions. So please keep your eyes out for that event and the eventual publication next year. Now, let's get to our topic for today's discussion. I'd like to first introduce our 5 panelists, most of whom are joining from the West Coast. We have Katie Ackerley of David Baker Architects, based in California. We have Regina Chen of Mass Design Group, based in Massachusetts. We have Jessica Goswick of Architects Fora, based in California. We have Corey Hawbecker of Holst, based in Oregon. And we have our representative of the nonprofit developer side, Jake Rosen of Resources for Community Development, also based in California. And just to give a lay of the land, here is our agenda for today. We're in the middle of the intro, after which we'll proceed through each panelist's brief presentations, all of which answer the same prompt, which is show us one thing you learned from a human-centered post-occupancy evaluation that surprised you, and one specific design decision you would change because of it. That should take us to roughly the 30-minute mark, after which we'll begin a conversation guided by prepared questions, with audience questions welcome through the Q&A tab. To orient us, I'm going to speak briefly about why we at the Joint Center are interested in post-occupancy evaluations and how they might inform more responsive, effective, and appealing affordable housing design work nationwide. You may hear post-occupancy evaluations referred to as POEs. So what is a POE? At the most basic level, it's a systematic assessment of a building once it has been occupied and used for a period of time. And to borrow language from our friends at David Baker Architects, a POE assesses how well buildings match users' needs and identifies ways to improve building design, performance, and fitness for purpose. There are, of course, many POEs that focus primarily on building performance through mechanical systems, environmental conditions, materials, and other technical metrics, but for the purposes of this conversation, we'll mostly be discussing POEs that involve more qualitative forms of research and direct engagement with residents or building staff. And so all of our panelists work at firms or organizations that have completed several POEs or are completing their first one, which is exciting, all of which evaluate recently completed multifamily affordable housing projects in various parts of the United States. In putting together the State of Housing Design 2027 book, we've been thinking about the agency of architects and designers in the housing production process, a role often understood to end once construction is complete. But in many ways, that's, of course, only the beginning of a building's lifespan. Assuming we build well, these are structures that will house their residents and exist in their neighborhoods for decades. One could argue that architects, developers, builders, funders, and regulators ought to understand how housing meets, falls short of, or deviates in surprising ways from the intentions set out for it. I imagine this discussion will show that POEs can inform both short-term spatial or management changes like furnishings, temperature settings, amenity hours, things like that, but also long-term design strategies for future development and design work. If architects, developers, and those who set design guidelines for affordable housing use the findings from POEs to build institutional knowledge, design decisions can contribute to a cumulative rather than piecemeal body of evidence, allowing teams to carry forward lessons learned instead of repeatedly making the same mistakes or assumptions about how people use their spaces, often without concrete evidence. To finish, I'll give a sense of the kinds of questions that might be asked in a POE focused on people. As part of our research for the State of Housing Design book, we recently released a public survey on US housing design. That survey, by the way, is still open for one more week until May 22nd, so we would greatly appreciate if you could take 5 minutes to fill it out in the next few days. That link should be in the chat now. So in the survey, we ask, what is one question you would ask residents after move-in to evaluate the success of a new housing development and inform future housing design? We've already received several hundred responses from a wide variety of housing professionals and advocates, from designers, academics, builders, and manufacturers to developers, realtors, code officials, and urban planners, many of whom I imagine may never have conducted a formal POE. But still, their answers are quite insightful. And just quickly, we can sort them into sort of 5 categories. The first being comfort and building performance. So these are questions about temperature, noise, daylight, and safety. For example, do you deal with excessive noise from adjacent units or outside? The second category being functionality of unit layouts, which could range in topic from design or arrangement of rooms within units to even material quality. Questions in this category might be, were you able to arrange furniture in a way you like and is functional? The third category would be about spaces and amenity zones. You'll see lots of this in the POE presentations to follow, including how often residents use amenities and whether spaces facilitate or discourage spontaneous encounters with neighbors. The fourth category is about retention and longevity. So how long residents intend to stay in a building, how affordability tracks over time, and whether they have a sense of community, and also how often like there are several intangibles that you can measure, like whether someone actually likes living in the space. And then the last category being retention and longevity. Oh, sorry. And the last category being an abstract sense of home. Sorry, I actually switched these in the presentation. That's why I was confused by what I was seeing on my slides. And so the fourth category would actually be about an abstract sense of home. Do you like where you live, and does it feel like home? So with that, I'm going to pass it off to the first of our speakers, which will be Katie Ackerley of David Baker Architects. So Katie, if you could come on camera, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Thanks so much, Aaron. This is really exciting to be a part of this and that you're doing this in the first place. So thank you. This is 222 Taylor in San Francisco. So imagine a really dense urban site, dirty, noisy. You can go to the next slide. I'm going to be kind of bringing in an indoor environmental quality angle to this discussion. A little bit about our history of POE. It started out actually with a partner that didn't want us to talk to residents. So we developed a staff survey and asked a question on behalf of residents. But the fortunate thing about that is we were able to ask that in a number of buildings. And when you ask the same question, as a standard across a number of buildings, you start to see patterns. This is not particularly a surprise, but I still think that collecting the data really allows you to step back and see like, oh yeah, acoustics, that's a really big deal for people in buildings. The second most biggest deal is the perceived air quality. You can go to the next one. So whether it's stuffiness or impacts from the outside, people in apartments are very sensitive to the control they have over their air. It's interesting to me because non-experts don't know the complex dynamics between thermal control and comfort and air quality. It's not something our bodies actually perceive accurately. It's all in sort of these proxies, right? Like air movement on the skin, coolness, A sense of, freshness comes from a variety of places. Um, and so you hear things like airflow, air circulation. These things are really important to people. So for example, in 222 Taylor, when we ask people, why do they open their windows and how often they open their windows? And this is a question we've asked in a number of buildings of residents, and the results are always very similar. And granted, we're in the Bay Area, keep that in mind. A lot of people keep windows open as much as they possibly can. And even though this building is in the middle of the city, it's dusty, it's noisy, and it doesn't have air conditioning. We used to not do that. Letting fresh air in is the biggest reason. So go to the next slide. We got fascinated with this when we started working with a new client. This is not our building, but we did some POEs in preparation for working with them, which is, by the way, I think the best application. This is a building that is right next to the freeway, and we looked in 2 units specifically and did some data logging of temperature, humidity, and CO2 over a 2-week period in the spring, I believe. And you go to the next slide. In both cases, one unit had a lot of solar exposure, but was right next to the freeway. The other unit was didn't have any solar exposure. It was significantly cooler in there, but a little bit less of a noise impact. In either case, these residents left their windows open all the time. The indoor temperatures were quite cool from an engineer's perspective, and that was the personal preference. So I think that says a lot about what we need to be thinking about when we design HVAC systems. We need to be thinking about them as we all, even architects, I think, have a tendency to think about environmental design more from the engineer's perspective, especially the specific systems. And if we think about them from the perspective of the residents, we get a lot of comments just of basic suspicion of, I don't know what's behind those grills, especially for hidden air systems. When there's a lot of sort of trinkets in the space, it can be very confusing and what's exactly happening. What am I paying for? What am I not paying for? So we haven't actually solved this yet, I would say, as an industry, but we've been advocating for more personal control or package systems that are legible to people, really easy to understand, more outreach to residents. And I think it's an ongoing conversation with product manufacturers. I think that's it for me.
Wonderful. Thank
How'd
you,
I do on
Katie.
time? 4 minutes?
You did great. You did
Great.
wonderfully. You can go camera off again, and the next speaker will be Corey Habecker of Holst. It's good that we're setting standards here. So, Corey, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you for having me. Like Aaron said, I'm Corey Habecker of Holst Architecture. I'm a principal and a sustainability director. We embarked upon this POE endeavor just sort of as a exercise to find out more about how we've been doing as architects designing for affordable housing. We've been doing a lot of that work and felt like just kind of a lack of feedback from the clients and the residents, and just did this to see, how we were doing. The project that we selected was called 72 Foster, which is, as you might guess, the corner of Foster Road and 72nd in Portland, Oregon. It's for Reach Community Development Corporation, affordable housing developer based in Portland. And this is 100 units of housing and targeting kind of lower end of the AMI, but not permanent supportive housing, which is kind of something we've been doing lately. But it was really illuminating to kind of review this building. So just to kind of orient everybody, the building's sort of this long dog-leg shape with a pass-through on the ground level. It's 4 stories tall. This is just the ground floor plan. And things to note here that will come up later are a community space facing a courtyard. There's like sort of this dead end and a pass-through that connects through, and that has to do with like easements that were required. Other things to note are the positions of the stairways. They're not one in the resident lobby, so it's just elevators to get to the resident floors, which turned out to be not the best choice, but was done for budgetary reasons. And then I guess go to the next slide, please. This is the fourth floor plan. The second and third floors are basically the same, but for at the corner there's a terrace and a lounge. The other floors have a unit at that location. Things to note here are the positions of the stairway. Again, on the left side of the screen, you'll see the stairway is positioned to create a dead-end corridor, which is legally allowed, but came up in resident surveys. And then that public, or I guess community space on that fourth floor, which we thought was going to be a really wonderful amenity for folks. And you can see a photograph of it down in the second image from the left. A really wonderful amenity, folks, with use of the mountains to the east, and turned out to be maybe not as popular as we had hoped. Next slide, please. So we do a combination of quantitative and qualitative surveys, and this is sort of the results of some of those conversations that we had. I guess the thing that was surprising to us was that there was just a general lack of feeling of safety throughout the building, particularly in some of the common spaces outside of the building, in the bike room especially. Around a quarter or less of the residents felt safe in those spaces, which was really a shock to us. And then the fourth floor balcony, also, half of people felt safe there, which is really a shock. Next slide, please. Here's some photographs. And the reason, we dove deeper into the results of those surveys, and a lot of the reasoning behind people not feeling safe was a lot of security issues. You can see here that people are, a lot of the doors are getting broken into. The bike room, there's a bike room on the ground floor and bike rooms on all the resident floors. They've been broken into and bikes stolen. And I think it just contributes to a general lack of feeling like they're secure in their residence. And then the pass-through, the image on the lower right, it was at the end of the cul-de-sac dead-end street, and people are driving through it. And that's supposed to be a pedestrian pass-through. So I think the kind of the vehicular activity that is making people feel unsafe as well. Next slide, please. I think this is my last, but I mentioned the dead end corridor, which is the plan in the lower left. I think this survey really opened our eyes to the perspective of the residents being much different than those of us, architects. A lot of the residents have experienced trauma. They've experienced a lot of difficulty in their lives, and so they have a different perspective on things. And things as simple as a dead end corridor, which didn't even occur to me would be an issue, creates feelings of like, well, how am I going to get out if there's an emergency? What if my neighbor down the hall I don't like or I don't get along with, and I have to pass by their door all the time? Kinds of things that don't really occur to me or a lot of my coworkers in our day-to-day lives become really big issues for them. So the residents in the dead-end corridor don't feel necessarily safe. I mentioned the elevator. Because elevators break down a lot and because the stairs aren't positioned in the lobby, it requires people to kind of go around the outside of the building to get upstairs if the elevators are broken down. Carpet in the corridors, which I thought was a great idea. A lot of times children are sent to the trash room to drop off the trash. They're not necessarily as careful with a gross bag of trash as I might be. And so there's a lot of staining and damage to the carpets. And then that fourth floor balcony, because I think of the kind of configuration of the building, configuration of that space, and the glass railing, people don't necessarily feel safe because of fear of heights and fear of things that might happen, again because of sort of inherent trauma or experiences in their lives. So a lot of that was just surprising, and it's really opened our eyes to be that's a little more empathetic in our design process. And I believe that's it for me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Corey. The next speaker will be Jake Rosen of Resources for Community Development.
Hey everyone, how's it going? Thanks, Aaron. I'm really happy to be here. I'm Jake Rosen, Associate Director of Real Estate Development at RCD. So just want to start with one quick slide about Resources for Community Development. I'm the nonprofit developer representative on the panel today. We're a nonprofit affordable housing developer based in Berkeley. We've got about 65 properties, and we serve over 6,000 residents. And our portfolio is mainly focused in the Bay Area. And a few years ago, we started some strategic organizational goals to better incorporate resident perspectives into our building designs. Historically, that feedback is secondhand. So we get that resident input, but it's mainly through resident services staff, asset management staff, or property management, kind of as a conduit, which has served us well, but also just has its limitations. And so last year, our real estate development team arrived at the post-occupancy evaluation as a tool that we could use to get feedback more directly from residents on how our buildings are working for them. So taken individually, that one-on-one engagement between real estate staff and residents allows project managers to better advocate on behalf of the people that we're serving throughout the design and construction process. And taken collectively, the sum of POE data that we're starting to get will inform our kind of internal design standards that become baseline across our new buildings. So we've started with 3 properties that are kind of 5 to 10 years old. And the aim is to eventually incorporate the POE as a standard for all of our new properties 2 or 3 years after completion. So next slide. The first property that we're starting with is called Ohlone Gardens. It's based in El Cerrito, a couple miles north of Berkeley, 57 apartments, mostly families. And we completed the POE here last November. We surveyed over 30% of the households in person and kind of one-on-one style surveys. And we chose Ohlone because this property has some really great long tenured residents who have lived here since it opened in 2015. And because in these kind of portfolio-wide pulse surveys that we've done, it gets a really high participation rates and pretty high overall satisfaction scores. And also this property includes all these great amenity spaces that we are not always able to provide just due to financing or physical constraints of a site. So it has this really great large lobby, community room with a kind of a common kitchen, it has a fitness room, a computer room, and then this really nice large courtyard that you see here. So next slide. And what did we find out? This was probably the most surprising outcome from the survey, and it pertains to those great amenity spaces, is that they're really not working as well as they should be or that we want them to. We asked a number of questions about the common areas in the building, but these 2 results here kind of spoke the loudest to me and were just the most surprising about the fact that these spaces aren't working. So the graph on the left, to me demonstrates that despite what we know about residents' apartments at this site and what, feedback we got is that for many of them, they're too small, they're constrained. There's, like I said, a lot of families at this property with 2, 3, 4 children. And that despite that, less than half of the residents would want access to this lovely community room beyond the hours that it's currently open, which are very limited. Right now, it's only open during when resident services holds programmed events or when residents request access for special events like birthdays. And then this second finding on the right also demonstrates kind of the fact that the courtyard is really not getting much use. So only 22% of the residents we surveyed use that space on a weekly or more basis. And there's correlation there that we found that the folks who are using that space daily or weekly are primarily households with young children, whereas the folks who are using it less than that or never are folks without children or kids older than 12. So it's this really kind of specific population that makes use of that whole space. So next slide. What do we do with that info? I think there's kind of a lot to chew on with that. And our survey, it's focused on the design aspects of the building, but we're not actually getting like specific design feedback. Why is the community room not working, for example? So we're left to guess a little bit. Um, but one thing that it's left me thinking is like, are these kind of larger all-purpose spaces that we're building? They're kind of like the Walmart parking lots of community spaces that work really well for the, whole building, large events, but which only happen really infrequently, maybe once or twice a year. Is that really serving the best daily needs of our communities? Should we instead be thinking about maybe more smaller, kind of more specialized spaces? And so this was reinforced by this response we got to this question on the right, where you can see residents are really more interested in kind of supporting these more specific activities. So fitness room, people really love this fitness room. They want a second one. Um, the barbecue got a lot of great votes. And only one person would ever want to include a reservable large meeting space, which is basically what we have now. And then we also received comments like this one, kind of about the nature of the evolving needs of a property, especially one where people are living there for a really long time. Kids are aging out of the playground that was built in 2015 and kind of need something different. So we also need to think more about, accommodating that flexibility and evolving needs of these spaces. That's it for me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jake. Our next speaker is Jessica Goswick from Architects Fora. Take it away, Jessica.
Hey everyone. Uh, Great to be here, and thank you, Aaron, for putting this on. It's really awesome to see the different types of outcomes that people are seeing in their post-occupancy evaluations and to start to compile some of these. To set the stage, I wanted to talk about how we think about community engagement at Fora and how the post-occupancy evaluation is an integral part of our design process. So the lessons we learn from our post-occupancy evaluations are really spread throughout our firm pretty immediately and help to make our current projects a lot better. So in this diagram, you'll see our purple arrows represent our architectural projects, and our yellow arrows represent our community engagement efforts, including our post-occupancy evaluations. And we see our work as holistic, continual, and evolving. So there's this continuous cycle of bringing diverse voices to the table to inform our projects early, like in design, in outreach with communities, and then designing with people who might live in and around our buildings to understand their needs. And then after a project is built, coming back and asking the residents and the communities around them how the projects are actually working for them so that we can inform the next project. And this has become a cycle that's really built into how we design at Fora. So in the next slide, the example I wanted to share today is Solaire Apartments. At Solaire Apartments, this conversation started with talking to the single family neighbors and the commercial neighbors around this downtown San Jose site. It was a merger of three kind of odd shaped parcels, which kind of feeds into what I'll talk about in a second. And in 2024, this project was completed and opened 130 new homes for low income and formerly homeless residents. So after 6 months, we went back to the building with our team, with the developer, Eden Housing, their resident services team, who was serving as case managers on the site, property management, and one of our favorite housing researchers to hear how this building was best serving the residents and staff and what could be improved both on this project in the kind of the near term and on future projects in the longer term. The next slide. So, like I said, we were working really closely with one of the collaborators that we work with often, Dr. Christina Bolo. She's a houser and a researcher at the University of Oregon. She really helped us craft questions that would help us understand the resident and staff experience within the building and get at things that we might not think of as designers originally, but we want to hear directly from the people who are actually using the space. And so one of the questions we asked was, how easy is it to navigate the building? What are challenges moving from space to space? Like I said, Solaire was built across this three parcel site, so it's a little bit of a unique shape. the building mass and the circulation paths are not maybe typical of other buildings that we've built. And so we were curious, like how these three arms of the building with the central courtyard were working and how residents were actually using these different spaces to move around the building. What we heard from residents and staff was interesting. We heard that the stairs were used a lot. So Corey mentioned stairs in his presentation as well. And you can see the three stairs in teal on this plan. Residents and staff both said that they used these a lot, especially if they lived on the second floor or if they were running home from work. We heard that the large windows in the courtyard and in the hallway made everything feel lighter and therefore safer because it was easier to see people coming around the corners. So in the image on the right, you can kind of make out Dr. Christina Bolo across the courtyard from us. And these large floor-to-ceiling windows at the corners allowed people to see who was coming and make decisions about which way they wanted to move in the corridor and how they wanted to continue. And then one surprising comment from a resident was that they wished there was an elevator away from the lobby. So the lobby is this image on the left. And right now that's the main entrance into the building. It's where two elevators and the main stair are. And they were hoping and wishing that there was an elevator away from the lobby so that they didn't have to, in their words, be on display and cross a lot of people as they came home in the evenings. So on the next slide, we were looking at how we could bring these comments together around circulation to inform our future projects. And we landed on a goal to provide multiple options for moving throughout the building. These comments reinforced one of the key principles of trauma-informed design, which is choice. And as designers, we sometimes think about designing like the entry or the path through a building, but we're learning that providing options throughout a building, like multiple stairways, elevators, and entrances, lets people choose how they want to interact with their neighbors and maybe staff on site. And there's sometimes like a design or a property management urge to close a stair, whether it's for security reasons or for egress reasons. And if we can open as many of those stairs and those pathways as possible to daily circulation, that increases this feeling of choice and safety. Also, providing transparency and visibility around corners and into common rooms helped residents choose if they want to enter a space before they do so. So in this image, you can see kind of, again, through the corner, someone coming around and make a choice on which direction you're going to go. And we heard that these opportunities for choice help residents and staff feel more comfortable and more safe, and are now working to integrate this more on our current projects.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jessica. Last but not least, we have Regina Chen of Mass Design Group. Take it away.
Hi, awesome. Thanks, Erin. So we are actually in the middle of our building use evaluation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the project, why it was designed the way it was, and what we're hoping to evaluate. So this is J.J. Carroll. It's a new 142-unit affordable housing development that primarily serves older adults, and was developed by Two Life Communities, this kind of incredible nonprofit organization in Massachusetts that has created a model of affordable senior housing that aims to help older adults, what they call age in community. So their work and the development at J.J. Carroll, Erin, if you go to the next slide, is ultimately aimed at addressing the epidemic of loneliness and social isolation in seniors, which many researchers say, is as bad for your health as smoking or heart disease. And yet on the next slide, there's a lot of research that shows that community and relationship can really help us live longer, happier, healthier lives. So on the next slide, Erin, that's what we set out to do. Go ahead and go to the next one. Just a little bit of context, J.J. Carroll is one of 5 buildings across a much larger campus in Brighton, in Boston, and Massachusetts. And in total, there are over 900 units across the campus. On the next slide, just kind of like an image, there were 64 existing units that were being replaced. Kind of like this really tiny image, 4 buildings that were kind of like these barrack-like, really similar to a lot of what was being built in the 60s and 70s. And so during our engagement, one thing that came up consistently was this question about how to maintain the scale of the existing buildings, the existing relationships, the neighbors and neighborhoods that people had developed despite the total development, almost more than doubling in size. On the next slide, what we were really hearing from that engagement was this effort to break down the scale of the building. People really appreciated their neighbors and the neighborhoods that they were able to develop, and we wanted to replicate that despite this increase in size. So on the next slide, we kind of showed, different diagrams and exercises that we were exploring to how we could kind of break down, starting with the most efficient double-loaded corridor, how do we actually break that down, create different neighborhoods? And so what you see are 5 different neighborhoods that we were able to create, kind of that shared this central spine, with the idea that we were able to create common spaces on each of the floors, that we were able to create outdoor courtyards, really to kind of promote this idea of social interaction and cohesion. On the next slide, this is what J.J. Carroll looks like. And if we go ahead to the next slide, this is an example of our second floor plan, and really ultimately what we want to evaluate. I think you might be able to tell right away that it's a much less efficient floor plan than you might typically see. Really trying to create in this like darker blue swath ample opportunities for open space and shared space on every floor. And really this idea runs fundamentally counter to the financial model of how affordable housing is developed, which really incentivizes maximizing rentable space, or the yellow space on this floor plan. Also, since Jessica kind of mentioned it, this blue Main Street doesn't have any, separate rooms. And so I think some of the design intention around that is a lot of what Jessica was talking around trauma-informed design and choice. Kind of like really building off the research of trauma-informed design of, as you're walking down a space, what can you see? What do you choose to enter into? What activities are going on? Maybe some people are playing cards and you actually want to sit across the way. You're kind of near them, but you don't necessarily want to play cards with them. So just kind of really creating ample opportunities, both for interaction as well as leaving residents the choice not to interact when they didn't want to. And if you keep going, Erin, really ultimately our partners are these incredible partners that want to make commitments to these shared spaces, but also really want to know if it mattered, if it made a difference. If it did make a difference, what are the design elements, and what are the elements of the design and space that do matter? So our research is looking at kind of 4 different elements of access, spatial organization, design features, and really how they support belonging, ownership, and the overall resident experience. And you can quickly go to the next line, Erin, just there's like a lot of design things that we're looking at and still also trying to understand what matters. And just to close this out, 2 things that we're already learning at J.J. Carroll, you can go ahead and advance, Erin, is just, and on the campus as a whole, is that the campus is really big and it can get confusing. I like studied maps in grad school and I got confused when, I first got there. And so if you came into the main entry at J.J. Carroll, you didn't necessarily know that there was an art room all the way on the other side of the campus. And so one of the things that we supported Two Life in doing shortly after the building opened in 2024 was to take a look at and update the overall signage plan across the entire campus to help kind of really communicate what residents were understanding and learning as they moved in and interacted with the building. And the second thing that we're learning about J.J. Carroll specifically is, really understanding how to right size the common spaces. There's a big common area on the ground floor, a main street on the second floor that connects to existing buildings, and there's common spaces on every floor, 3 through 6 above it. And we've started to hear that sometimes people might go out looking for activity and not see anybody in the room that they were kind of first going to, and so they'll have to kind of keep going to the next space. And so that's one thing we're really trying to understand better with our evaluation is like, where is that happening? How much of it is because people are still moving in and getting used to the space? How do you design shared spaces that have enough activity in them that they're supporting connection, but they aren't so limited that they get overcrowded and thus deter connection or interaction from happening? And really, ultimately, our goal is to help guide future projects in making the right decisions and right sizing the amount of common spaces. So that's it for me. Thanks, Erin.
Wonderful. Thank you, Regina. And thank you to all of our panelists. Those were such great presentations and really covered a wide range of project types. If I could have all of our panelists now turn on their cameras, we can begin a conversation. I think the first sort of like macro question that I want to ask is pretty big picture before we get into methodologies and all the nitty-gritty stuff that I'm sure you'll all have fun talking about. And that question is just why do a POE? What's the sort of benefit? What's the kind of like philosophical backing behind your firm, engaging or your organization engaging in this work? So I can do like a sort of lightning round robin of everyone's thoughts on that. Want to just go backwards? So Regina first, and then
Yeah, I think a lot of people, yeah, I was going to just say just to learn. But I think really ultimately understanding the differences between like what an architect might think or even what the staff might think is going on and hearing from residents themselves. I'll give an example if that's okay. This isn't a lightning round, but one evaluation kind of for other buildings that we looked at post-COVID was understanding kind of how older adults, where they felt safe in common spaces. And we thought some of the outdoor spaces, like in 2021, were going to be the places that the seniors felt the most safe. And really what they said was there were certain gazebo spaces that they were afraid to use because they were afraid if they fell, no one would see them because it was a little bit more outside the central spaces where staff were, where people were operating all the time. And so kind of like really getting that firsthand experience of the end user of your space, I think really gives us, in the same way that you would want to do pre-design engagement and understanding outside of the experience that I personally have or our designers have.
great. Should we go to Jessica next?
Yeah, I think Regina, great point. For us, it's very similar, and a lot of it is testing our hypothesis. Like, did the design work? We heard from all of these people at the beginning, or maybe putting in lessons we learned on other projects, and then how did that succeed or not succeed, and how can we make it better both now and on future projects? And so, yeah, one of the big benefits is having that feedback from the people that we're actually serving and not making assumptions about what people might want in their homes or in their buildings.
Great. Jake?
Yeah, I mean, I think similar. I think the role of the real estate developer, I mean, a lot of what we're doing is kind of like taking a bunch of information and data to make a million decisions every day. And so getting this like really rich kind of nuanced feedback from the communities that we serve is another data point to help us make those decisions. And like really help us kind of advocate maybe from more of like a personal perspective while we're in design development or we're in construction, where we can really say, oh, instead of speculating about what might be the best, we can actually say with a little bit more authority about how decisions should be made. And that's super valuable.
Awesome. On to Corey.
I think I mentioned this in my little talk, but just sort of having empathy and understanding where the residents are coming from. We really endeavor to do, community engagement at the front end, but because the residents who are going to live there aren't known yet, they haven't yet applied. It's really hard to kind of get their pre-feedback and understand what it is that they need. We can talk to the building owners and hear what they anticipate the need to be, but they don't know either necessarily. And so it's really valuable after the building's occupied to find out how it's operating for the people who are actually experiencing that. Their lived experience is very different from the architects usually. And so hearing the things that they're struggling with and what's challenging to them is really valuable. And then, it's been mentioned a couple times, but using that information, feeding that back into future projects. The project I mentioned, we were actually at the time designing another building for that same owner 2 blocks away, and we're able to use a lot of the feedback. And like I mentioned, the owner doesn't necessarily know either. So we were able to tell them, actually, what your residents are telling us about this other project is this, and this is how we should respond to it on the current design. So it's been really valuable, and the owners really appreciate it as well.
Great. And last, Katie.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I'll add two things. One, I guess, so David Baker Architects has been doing this for a long time, right? So there's a certain amount of natural learning that comes from working with, a broad array of nonprofit clients and for doing it over time, largely in the same place. What I found that POE does, so I think a lot of architects have these sort of ad hoc ways of gathering feedback. What I like about a POE, and it doesn't have to be that fancy, but I think it's important to add a sort of systematic, like a structure to it, because what often happens is that we have something that's top of mind when we go in. We come in with a bias to any sort of feedback loop kind of exercise. And so it's those things that elevate what's unseen, but it's almost like it's so important that it's not that it's not elevated in the design process, going back to the quality of the environment, the air, people's physical experience in their space, and how that affects how their sense of home. It's so important we don't, because it's automatic to us. We're constantly making little adjustments to our own thermal environment without knowing it. But as designers, we're not conscious. And in design, you have cost, you have compliance, you have maybe some design standards, maybe some green building standards, but you still don't have that kind of real mission aligned input from like the people you're serving, as just to put that on an even playing field with the other kind of data or constraints that you're working towards. And so it's inevitably going to fall to the bottom of the stack. So I appreciate what RCD is doing.
Yeah. I think a lot of you are touching on the fact that I don't think POEs come out of nowhere. They're not things that are completely foreign in method or in philosophy to things that development teams already do. So like engaging in pre-design community engagement is something that a lot of architects and developers already do. Doing, as Katie mentioned, sort of ad hoc data collection, site visits, walkthroughs with management, things like that of existing buildings is already part of the repertoire, and then working with data, as Jake was talking about, even qualitative information counts as data. So I think it's sort of building more circularity into the system rather than having it be fits and starts that begin anew with every single project. So that's really informative. I think we have tons of questions in the Q&A panel about methodology. People are chomping at the bit to learn about like how you put one of these together. So I think there's a few basic questions like when you're doing resident or staff engagement, literally what is the format that you're using? Are these phone calls? Are they digital surveys? Are you going door to door? Are you slipping things under people's doors? What is and I saw a lot of photos of what looked like focus group meetings or resident meetings. So if anyone wants to sort of jump in and kind of like talk about the sort of basics of how you set one of these up and what the sort of base data collection methodology is for more qualitative forms of POEs. And that can be anyone. So as
I
soon
can
as you
jump
feel,
in.
yeah, great.
Yeah, I would say the answer is it depends on the residents. For the post-occupancy evaluation that I discussed, there was a lot of resident engagement via essentially digital surveys. So we posted QR codes around the building and it linked to the survey that we put together in different languages that we learned that the residents spoke. And really, it started with like a discussion with the resident services coordinator on site who knows everybody in the building and knows what they are able to do and knows how to best reach them because they're coordinating a lot of events and they're talking to people and they know what works to reach the residents. So for that group, posting signs around the building with the QR codes is really successful to get them to do digital surveys. And we also did some on-site, in-person focus group discussions. And the resident services coordinator advised us bring food because you're asking something of them, you need to give something back. They don't have a lot of time, so show up at dinner with pizza and you'll get some people who want to participate. And that was really valuable. The second POE we did is a much more, I guess, population that's struggling, people who are just coming out of homelessness. And they don't all have phones. They don't all have the capability of doing that. And their schedules are highly variable with the work-life balance. And so for that one, it was really we just showed up every Monday morning with donuts and tried to snag people as they're, moving through the building. So there wasn't really the same kind of engagement. And it really came down to that's what the resident services folks on site told us would work. So it really just depends.
The main takeaway is always bring food, always provide food. I think I'll just add to that. Katie mentioned this earlier. My personal favorite survey instrument is like a semi-structured interview format where you kind of have an idea of what questions you want to go through, but you're really leaving a lot of space for people to answer things that you might not have expected. Kind of like the paper survey instrument is great also, especially if in our case, we're trying to understand its impact on social isolation. And if the people that might not respond or the people that aren't in the common spaces are some of your key target audience that you really want to be able to understand what their experience is. But you only have so much that somebody could answer on paper if they're circling a question or writing in their own answer. I would also add, as much as possible, getting diverse perspectives. And so in our case, hearing from the staff also their experience as well as their perception of the resident experience. We have many residents, I think Corey was touching on this or answered this, that, might have like cognitive or physical disability. And so really kind of understanding the volunteer experience, the staff experience, what their perceptions of the resident experience are, can all really help triangulate what is actually happening from different perspectives.
I'll just add really quickly to add to that I think the most important thing is not, other than food, is not to get stuck in an idea of what you think a POE looks like, because it completely has to do with your objectives. We all sort of lead with like, oh, we're going to do a survey. Surveys are way easier said than done. You know what I mean? And sometimes what you really want is focus group. Sometimes, you really want to do the donuts every Monday and, just kind of pull people aside. As long as you have that, structured format where you're able to kind of systematically go through your questions. I really wouldn't get bogged down in what it looks like ahead of time.
Yeah, I agree. We've had POEs that were like community building activities. So we had like a pot your own plant activity where all of our team came and we invited residents. So there was flyers posted on the doors and on the bulletin boards in the building. There was an email sent out in the resident newsletter, like, next week, Architects 4 is going to be here to hear what you think about the building. We're going to have tons of plants and pots, and you can paint your own pot and plant something. And it was a building, like Corey was saying, where you talk to residents and resident services is saying like, oh, these residents really love their gardens. So we said like, okay, we're going to bring plants and we're going to plant with people and hear their feedback. And so we brought paper surveys and took notes as we were having conversations. And it was nice, I think, to add to what everyone is saying, to give residents and staff notice ahead of time. And if possible, even provide like some of the questions that you might be interested in so that they can gather their thoughts. We had some residents and staff who were like prepared with their like printed out survey already. Like I wrote down everything I ever thought about the apartment that I live in, and that's really valuable. And also a way to get different perspectives, people who maybe are just dropping it off, people who are doing it virtually, and people who are coming to hang out and be interviewed.
Yeah, I've had that same experience too, Jessica, where we do a lot of like affirmative outreach to residents beforehand to get them to sign up. And, we want 100% of the households to sign up. And that's all done by the on-site resident services staff. And as a part of that, we send out the survey kind of in paper form. We try to understand if there's language barriers and get it translated beforehand. And it's so awesome to see how excited like people are already answering the questions and they're super prepared. And that just means we get even more kind of informed feedback. I think RCD surveys definitely strays towards the like more kind of maybe formal end of the spectrum, where we're sending out to RCD staff, so mostly real estate development, but also folks from our accounting department, folks from asset management who also might not have a lot of engagement directly with residents, but are really eager to get that. And we're, kind of reserve the community room or maybe the services office for that kind of set amount of time and have a set of questions. And find that qualitative feedback we're getting, which kind of turns into a conversation, is so valuable. And it's really what you miss from doing kind of like a survey blast, right? Or something that's digital. And since kind of the, maybe goal 1B of our surveys is to get that kind of direct engagement, it's super important that we kind of have that face to face. I think one kind of challenge that I want to bring up that was not as hard for us to navigate, or not as hard as I expected it to be, but to navigate was this kind of central issue that the feedback we're getting from folks is not directly necessarily going to benefit them, right? Like we're getting this feedback to inform future buildings and future designs. And so really, really being clear about that intent and saying, hey, that's why we bring food. That's why we incentivize folks with gift cards, is to really make sure they're being kind of compensated and, as a courtesy to the residents for their time. But to really make that clear, like we know that there might be issues at this building. These answers aren't necessarily going to address those, right? And that's something that's hard, but that's something I really consider, urge everyone to consider how you frame that survey when you're speaking to folks.
Yeah, these are all excellent answers and super rich and insightful. I think something that I don't think there's a lot of clarity on right now is how long after a building's completion you all are doing this. So if we could go around and say that again. And then I also think that's something that came up several times is involvement with staff, and that's usually staff supporting the engagement with residents. We have a few questions about engagement with staff directly. So do you have a separate POE, like a formalized POE process to talk to custodians, security guards, people who are operating and maintaining the buildings on a daily basis? They obviously have a wealth of knowledge that architects would not normally have. And so I guess people are, and I'm sort of wondering, is there kind of like a two-track system where you're engaging with residents and engaging with staff at the same time? Are they two separate processes? How does that all work? And also mention how long after a project's completion you're doing this.
18 months, and yes.
Okay, great.
18 months minimum, very minimum. Like the longer, the better. What does Christina say? It's like a break-in period for, imagine all these people moving into one building together.
Mm-hmm. And how long does the actual, like, are you doing it for 1 year then? How long does the POE process take?
I mean, when you do resident surveys, it would just be, the couple of weeks, however many sessions of one-on-one interviews we do, and then, but we're collecting the utility data if they're able to share it, kind of adding that layer.
Yeah.
My favorite answer is it depends. The first one we did, the one I presented, that was over the course of a few months. And for both of the POEs we've completed, we start with essentially a walkthrough with staff to have them identify issues with the building, and an interview with the resident services coordinator where we learn a lot about the demographics and the folks who live there. So that's how we start it. And then the depends part comes in with to what extent we're doing quantitative data. So if it's just surveys and resident focus groups, you can accomplish that over, I think we did it over the course of like 2 or 3 months, just to have a number of events spread out over time. For the one where we did, placing of sensors around the building, that took 15 months beginning to end. And a lot of that was just, collecting the data over time. In terms of when to do them, in our views, it's good to have a couple of years behind, of occupancy. So you get some people who've been there for a little while. You have a couple of seasons. So people have like a really hot summer or a really cold winter under their belt, and they can kind of understand the comfort and the air quality issues that come about because of that. Because if it's just like that year happened to be really mild, you're not going to really get to the bottom of those kinds of issues.
Yeah, I agree with that layer of having as much time as possible. I think to speak a little bit to this to the staff portion as well, we have a similar process as Corey where we are talking to staff before we come in to kind of get a lay of the land. But also a lot of the staff that we have spoken to are also residents on the site, like the property manager and sometimes even some of the resident services people will live in that building, like in Solaire. At least four of the staff people, including the lead maintenance person, lives in one of the apartments. And so it's also an opportunity to get their understanding as residents and in their workplace. Like, how is the office space at this property? We learned like it's really loud because it's next to the elevator, which we didn't realize the elevator was going to be so loud. So, to Katie's point about noise being a big concern for residents, it's also a concern for staff. Like, these people have to hold meetings. Sometimes they're holding sensitive meetings with residents that need certain amounts of privacy. And so, part of the surveys that we do and part of the interviews with site staff is to inform our kind of like workplace design or the office design of these buildings because as we design more permanent supportive housing and other types of housing that have integral services, there's more and more of that office space and wanting to make it as nice for staff and residents who are coming to visit as possible requires that we get that feedback from the staff.
I was also just going to be contrarian for the sake of it, but I think when to do it, in an ideal world where there are no constraints on time or budget, you would do it many times over the life of a building. And for example, and I think you could also maybe even separate out the formal, building use post-occupancy evaluation from less formal conversations and just really understanding, there's a benefit to going in a month after. Do people understand how the building works, how it was designed to work? Are there changes programmatically or signage wise that you could make on a quicker turnaround because you're already hearing some feedback? We don't know how to get here, or we actually didn't think we could touch this thing, but actually it was designed for you to be able to move the furniture around this room. And so I do think, like, yes, you want to wait long enough to understand how people are using it so you can learn from that, but also are there opportunities to really understand what is already happening? How might people be confused? How might people need to actually learn a little bit more about how the building was designed or why it was designed the way it was so that they can use it better or more efficiently, effectively. So I do think there is, I would say, like after 2020, you should do another evaluation because people use space totally differently than they did in 2019. So I think in an ideal world, you're doing it often and when you can and at key moments. And then that just comes back to balancing, we don't have unlimited time or budget to do these evaluations. So how do you kind of pick the most strategic moment where you can get those lessons learned and also have the impact that you're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everyone else said too, that waiting for the property to kind of stabilize is super important. So in the 2-3 year range. I also think just thinking about kind of where that property, what's going on at that property and being really sensitive to that. So, it would be preferable to conduct these surveys when there's a really high degree of trust at that property. So, there was one that we were really excited to look at this summer, but then learned from site staff that there was just a lot of kind of transition going on with property management and kind of just a lot of resident complaints, resident distrust. And so it felt like, okay, we should just back off. Maybe that we need to wait for that to stabilize. Maybe we wait for another year until the staff situation is a little bit more consistent. So that's also something that's really important to consider. And then on the staff survey question, we do have a totally different survey for staff, which hits similar points about how they experience the design of the building. And like Jessica mentioned, talks about the offices, right? And like how do they experience all the glazing in an office? Is it a fishbowl, or do they like having all that visibility? Why do we spend all this money on these wonderful storefronts and then they just have their curtains up all the time? So that's like always something we're trying to kind of figure out. And we're also thinking about like the maintainability of the site. So talking to maintenance and janitorial staff is really critical because designing a space, selecting the finishes that are easy to replace or it's easy to clean is so important to how just the experience of that community. And so trying to learn more, I think Corey mentioned the trash, the nice, lovely trash stream on the carpet. And that's a nightmare for maintenance. They don't want it to be dirty either, but they don't have the budget during operations to swap out all the carpet for resilient flooring, right? So thinking about flaws like that's important.
Yeah, I want to touch really quickly just on what, like speaking to the maintenance point and to what Regina was talking about, like an earlier POE, there is some value in doing an earlier informal or formal, whatever you can do, assessment, maybe during a warranty walk before those warranties expire to find like, are there things or is there like a little bit of extra project budget that needs to be used in the next year that if there's something that's not working for residents, we can immediately act on. And then that feeds into like building the trust with residents of like, in Solaire, for instance, we went in at 6 months and we said, like, how are things working? And we learned that the residential heating and cooling wasn't working as well as we thought. And it was a problem with the louver system that was installed, that was like a custom system. And so we were working really closely with the manufacturer since it was still under warranty and with the contractor since they hadn't fully left the site, like fully been, they've been on the site recently to make that change. And then hopefully come back later. Like we would like to come back again and do a more formal POE where we can see if that even worked.
Yeah.
That's a great point. I'm surprised how proactive we sometimes have to be in those first 10 months to be looped in.
We're beginning to also scrape at the surface of everyone's favorite topic, which is how to finance these. And we have a few questions also about how you convince clientele to let you, if you're a firm, for instance, to lead this type of effort. So if people want to speak to whether you're comfortable sharing how much it typically costs to engage in one of these, or how you actually get funding to do one. Is it coming out of, construction loans? Is it coming from foundations? Is it coming from pro bono funding streams within the practice? And also, are these usually conducted when you have an enduring client architect relationship, for instance, where you feel like you might be working with that client in the future, and so they're sort of convinced by the benefits of doing this, or do are you conducting POEs with sort of new clientele that are just excited about the idea? So if anyone wants to elaborate on any of that, feel free.
I know I have a lot of strong opinions about this, mainly that I don't think it has to cost a lot of money. I don't think anyone should exceed their ability to process the data that they collect. And there's so many different methods that you could apply. So the pre-design phase, especially with a new client actually, is where there's sort of a natural sort of resource base for doing a POE of, it doesn't even have to be your project. You could learn a lot from, learning about other projects with similar resident population. So that's probably the most success that we've done is a structured site tour, not the resident survey, but a site tour with staff sort of, interviews and make a report, right? It's not just do the tour and you sort of like are there together, but the POE part is like, okay, we had some rigor, some discipline about what we were asking, and then we had a result. So I'll stop there, but otherwise the sort of true post-occupancy evaluations have cost a little bit of money, and it's been a mix of being paid for and doing it pro bono.
Yeah, agreed with Katie. We have a mix of pro bono and paid for, and some of the funding in the paid POEs we're seeing is coming from like leftover project budget. So if you're lucky enough to have leftover budget at the end, especially if it needs to be used, We've used that. We're working with the team to do a paid POE that way. Another thing to speak to the point about like you don't have to spend a lot of money on this is part of our firm structure. We're a 100% remote firm, but part of our firm structure allows each team member to have time, like up to 8 hours a week for research in an area that they're interested in and that they're passionate about. And this kind of structure that allows people to look into things that they're interested in has helped us develop these post-occupancy evaluations and then deploy them. And because our firm, I think, has so much interest and learns so much from these evaluations, it is something that we put some of our overhead into. So it's kind of a balance between getting external funds and kind of matching internally as well.
We've done some pro bono. The most recent one we've done, actually, we sought out and obtained a grant through the Energy Trust of Oregon, which is sort of a utility funded organization. And that came with it some stipulations about doing energy analysis and comfort analysis and things like that. But it was really a valuable thing. I don't think we could have done the work that we did without it. And that was $60,000. And I believe we spent every penny of it.
We actually have pursued some grants to support the research efforts. It's been for us a mix of overhead time. I like to call it my spare time, which I have a lot of, and going for grants.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, we really tried to do it really lean. And we're also not, we're not doing the kind of energy, kind of quantitative type of data collection through these either. So I think that probably would increase cost. And also because our staff is actually kind of going out to the sites and conducting the interviews. We save a lot of money that way. But that's also one big drawback is like, that's a lot of kind of logistics and there's just mechanics around scheduling, aligning the schedules for the residents with our staff. So it takes more effort on our part. And that's been a lot of my role is just kind of like that coordination and that hand holding. And we are kind of, what we've been doing is actually charging these costs to projects that are in design development with the kind of logic that what we hear from the surveys will be incorporated into the design of those buildings. So that's been effective for us. Also, make sure you hold budget for, like I mentioned this before, gift cards for residents. That's really important. And the food budget, of course.
I was just going to say the gift card budget and the Monday donut budget are
Yeah.
important line items. It's sort of, I think like my next question about this is like, because, POEs are not sort of naturally a part of the architecture funding stream. And so I guess the other question would be like within an architecture firm, for instance, this takes a very particular set of skills to be able to do. Like survey design is something that's like not necessarily easy. And I know that some of your firms have, people that sort of, and many of you may be those people that sort of lead these efforts or the sort of go-to person for conducting these evaluations. How do you build capacity within a practice to actually do one of these? What are the learning tools that you used? Are people coming in with a lot of experience and engagement? I know that might be the case in some areas, but yeah, how do you actually sort of build it into the firm's kind of like collective body of skills to be able to conduct these into the future? And I guess tied into that, like, do you see this as an emerging trend? Is it something that you see more firms doing now or fewer firms doing now? Some of you have been in the field for longer than others. So how do you see it kind of evolving on the broader housing design stage?
I can start. I think our firm is a little bit unique, but a lot of our engagement was spearheaded and led by our community engagement lead, Nicole Little, and she came to Fora with a strong engagement background, which was really, really beneficial and has shaped, I think, the way that we design over the past few years and how we've included that. And so that was like the first step is like having someone who's really passionate about it to be interested in leading the effort. And then two, bringing other people in to learn about how these are done. Because, yeah, like you said, we're architects, we're not necessarily researchers, but we've partnered a lot with researchers at universities and other architecture firms that have been doing this to understand and share tools. Like we've looked to David Baker's shared evaluation walks templates. Like, how can we do something similar? What works for our projects? Who can we talk to like review our survey questions to make sure that they're um, open enough and provide the feedback we need. And then that's kind of a like shared relationship. Like we can give our portfolio to those researchers for their use in their academic research as well. And so there's a reciprocal relationship there. And then in terms of training up our team, I think we're a really small group. There's 12 of us, I think, right now at Architects Fora, and we all do the focus group. Since we're 100% remote, this is like our chance to all be in person and talk to our residents and really hear like directly the feedback that informs our design. And I think a lot of the feedback we hear at these post-occupancy evaluation groups or interviews sticks in our brains a lot more than maybe what you see on a webinar or what you learned in, maybe what you learned in school or what you saw on a project a while back. And so by just practicing, like going to these post-occupancy evaluations together, people learn and are able to start to lead sections of post-occupancy evaluation on their own projects.
I think as architects, we also have the beginnings of the tools needed. Understanding what our like the impact our buildings can have on people, and really just reaching out and engaging those people to learn more about how, like, what their experience is like with those buildings. I think we have an inherent interest in that, and so that kind of makes it easy. From our point of view, or from a host's perspective, we've been really lucky in that my colleague Maggie Harris, who's actually the fellow who received the grant to do the latest POE that we're doing. She has a background in research, so she's a PhD candidate currently, and so really leaned heavily on her knowledge about best practices around surveys and focus groups and that sort of thing. That was really helpful.
At different times in Mass's life, we've had epidemiologists or different research backgrounds that have weighed into a lot of our methodologies. In my jaded with architecture era, I worked in survey research and a public policy research firm, so I also bring that background. I think there's also varying levels of training that you want your team to know about. So like I know a little bit about like the chi-squared test and the modified Delphi method. And sometimes it's helpful to have somebody with deep knowledge about like research tools and methodologies to be able to offer options that you didn't know. The person who knows that and also design and can apply them, they are few and far between, I think. And so really figuring out how you kind of structure your team holistically. There are also, I would say maybe the most important thing for team members to get trained in is just like bias awareness. And that's something that's important for like end of year reviews, as well as for stakeholder engagements, as well as for survey administration. And so I think there's different levels of types of training and what you want your team to know about. And they will apply at different, kind of going back to Corey's favorite answer, it depends. But kind of going back to some of the different, you want everyone to have bias training. Maybe not everyone needs to know how to analyze the data. And so just thinking about how your team composition overall comes together is also really important.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think what I'll add to this is in terms of cost and capacity, I guess we just talk about capacity. There's sort of three sticking points. One is like just having the number of people available to do the interviews if you want, a good response rate. And I will just say, echo what Jessica and Corey said, is that like we have no problem finding willing volunteers from our office who will take their evenings, multiple weeks in a row just to sit and talk with residents. So we always do that sort of volunteer basis. The second is writing effective questions or setting up an effective structure. I do bring that background to the office. I have a building science and survey background, although it was I learned on the job, it's very different from what I think is the right methods that we use here. And in doing this with a number of different developers, I find that when you beta test and workshop the questions with the staff sort of stakeholders, they come up with a lot better questions sometimes. And then the third thing is processing survey data and quantitative data. Once you have the right question, that's easy. It's the open-ended responses and knowing how to summarize that and really extract meaningful, insightful, not too mushy feedback. That's the thing I'm most stuck on, to be honest. I'd be curious to know if others have come up with a great solution. So far, I basically do that for us. Yeah.
Yeah, we have like we're developing tools to sort that kind of information. I think a lot of our process is like putting all the comments in one thing and thematically coding like where things go together and pulling out like if there's common themes where the like plus ones are if we see a comment a lot of times. Um, but it's trickier than quantitative data and sometimes it's out of context. Like you might get a comment from something that's actually applicable to something else or was misinterpreting what you were intending to ask and sorting through that requires a little bit of training, which is why it's helpful when the person who's doing it was also the one listening to the feedback when they
Totally.
received it. Hmm.
I find that there's a kind of a miss, and if I sort of bring a staff person on to kind of help someone who's really interested, that thematizing, you need like
Yeah.
a sentence. You can't just be like common room is a category. It's like a subject, object, verb,
Yeah.
idea, concept. And then also sometimes you have one resident give a really insightful response. So it's just one data point, but it really was specific enough and that you can just tell this is a really good piece of input. And so it's really not an exact science.
Hmm.
Yeah. I have like one last like kind of bigger question I wanted to ask, but there's a few other questions and I sense that a lot of our audience is here to learn. And so I just wanted to do really quick lightning, like one line answers from like two people for each of these quick questions. The first one being, have you ever heard of a POE for affordable ownership housing, or have you ever done one for affordable ownership housing, or has everything been for rental?
No, I mean, you could use mine if you wanted.
Yeah. So all rental across every yeah, okay. The other one would be, do you share feedback with residents before changes are made? Like are results ever collated and shared? Yes.
Yes, huge part of the process, accountability.
And are you doing that at meetings or in sort of
Mostly
distribution?
like an email share out. Like if you filled out a survey, you check a box. Like, do you want the report for this?
Great.
Hmm.
Interesting. And then the last one being, a lot of you spoke about amenity spaces, and I know that we're limited in terms of what kinds of housing models and plans we can finance in the US in terms of multifamily affordable, but do you ever ask about like unit plans or like specific layouts of rooms and, and window placement and things like that? Does that factor into POEs typically?
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's huge. I mean, just how people, what and thinking what we thought about too is like, okay, maybe the unit size is kind of fixed. We need to be efficient, but would you rather have an floor plan kind of concept between the living room and kitchen, or do you really appreciate having those separated as much as possible? So that allows us to still work within the kind of financing constraints we have, but work towards residents' needs as well.
Great. And so my last sort of larger question is about kind of like who owns the POE. Obviously, you guys are a group of architects and a nonprofit developer, critical parts of the development team and development process for affordable housing, but also just part of it. So, there's a whole slew of like housing regulators, people who write the guidelines for, what's required in affordable housing design at a state level or at local levels sometimes. I guess I wonder, what would you argue is the benefit of architects doing this or of developers doing this, and how would you advocate for like integrating the findings into the bigger picture of like how affordable housing design is regulated. Do you think that housing agencies, for instance, should be more closely involved in these processes? I know from visiting several Holst projects, Corey, in Oregon, that there was a huge mismatch in like demand for bike storage and bike storage requirements in Oregon, for instance, that were eventually changed. And so, things like that, like how do you actually do you have ways to communicate these to city agencies or state agencies and yeah, what does that system sort of look like to you?
Currently, there's nothing formal, although I think there is probably a benefit in making it a more rigorous process. The amount of POE adoption is really light right now. There's only a few firms doing it. There's only a few developers asking for it. And so I think it need to be a little bit more universal. Because if it's sort of self-selected, I think you might get skewed results. Developers and architects who aren't taking this as seriously aren't analyzing their potentially really poor results, and so you don't have those data points. So perhaps, as you maybe are alluding to, maybe a condition of the public funding might be some sort of POE. I think that would be a real benefit to the community.
I think this answers the question. I do think these types of results could figure into state QAPs. We did this as an exercise that for the District of Columbia, we created affordable family housing guidelines, and one of the intents is to sort of inform that the QAP there. Your methods depend on your objectives, so it might be a dedicated, exercise, but I think there's a lot there because there's a mismatch between what funders sort of require of you and what the kind of needs of the market are.
I'm just going to hop
I
into
think
say
likewise.
QAP being qualified allocation plan, which is how states or jurisdictions distribute funding for housing tax credits.
And set standards for those developments, yeah.
Yeah, we can justify it. I think, of course, we want our projects to be better and for our communities. Also, part of MASS's mission is systemic impact. So, kind of really understanding impact outside of individual projects. And how, so I think there's a future where maybe the incentives for common spaces might, make its way into the QAP or different financial structures more. And honestly, part of my answer is like partnering with a joint center and just thinking about kind of, Mass has maybe a little bit more specific of a domain. And if I may, Jake, feel free to answer too. I'm curious, like, does the Joint Center do POEs? Would you be interested in it? What do you think the role of the Joint Center might be in kind of making those connections between individual project evaluations and policy change?
Is that a question for me or for
yeah. I'm realizing you're a fellow at the Joint Center, so no pressure, but I would just open up that question also back
I think
at the Joint Center.
The Joint Center has been, Regina, as you know, the Joint Center might be helping out with a POE at JJ Carroll. The Joint Center is not directly involved in conducting POEs. We're not part of development teams. But I think, what we do well is hosting events like this and sharing knowledge. And I think a lot of what you guys are pointing to is that we need to part of making POEs more common practice and building out capacity in the industry at large and in the development world for affordable housing is sharing knowledge. David Baker Architects have been great about that for years, of course, sharing toolkits and things. And I will say that several other firms have their reports available online. I believe Holst's reports are available on their websites, and so there's in terms of material sharing, I think that's a critical part of getting this adopted more widely. So that's where I see us helping, and hopefully the book will also aid in that.
Yeah, I think academic institutions have been really crucial and they have like this other role, like where it's nice for architects and designers to do this work so that they get direct feedback. The researchers that we've worked with at academic institutions have been able to see across a range of architects and across a range of developers on a similar project types and find trends across the industry that have been really insightful in informing some of these standards that Katie was talking about, but also in just like checking these kind of unique conditions and then seeing them many times really reinforces like what's important in these projects.
Great. Wonderful.
I think we should
Well,
just drop all of our favorite survey questions in one central repository. And Aaron, if you want to host that, that would be awesome.
yeah, I
That's
would
the one
actually,
thing we don't put on our website because it's taken out of context and it keeps changing. But
yeah.
man, like just the questions you put up at the top, I was like, ooh, that was a good one.
Yeah. I'll source that from all of you. Maybe we can put it in the book. Have some quotes in there. That would be awesome if you're willing to share. Well, thank you all. We are at time, and I want to respect everyone's time. Thank you to everyone who attended this event from various parts of the country and world. And thank you to our panelists who joined from all over the US. And once again, the recording for this will be available on the Joint Center's website as a video, and this will also be transcribed in a pared down way in the State of Housing Design 2027, which is due for release early next year. So keep your eyes out for all of that. Thanks, everyone, and have a great weekend,
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Erin.
everyone.